All right, I'd just like to thank everyone for attending this 4th of April 2022 meeting or showcase of the Hunter Living Histories. I wish to acknowledge that we at the University of Newcastle are meeting on the traditional lands of the Awabakal people, formerly known as the Newcastle tribe and the Mumlumbimban clan. And I wish to pay my respects to their elders, both past, present, and those yet to be, and also send an acknowledgement out to the Aboriginal custodians of the lands you're all zooming in to us from wherever you are across the state and country, and also pay my respects to any Indigenous people that are joining us today for this gathering. So, Anne, any apologies for today?
Yes, we've got apologies from Gary Jones, Professor John Fryer, Tim Adams, and Professor Marie Gleeson.
Okay, thank you. Any other apologies people would like to report? All right. So, Anne, did you want to acknowledge the passing of the Honourable Bob Brown, AM?
Yes, so we just heard from one of our colleagues up at the Coalfields Heritage Centre, Lexi, who let us know this morning that, the Honourable Bob Brown, AM, passed away over the weekend. He was at the recent opening of the Coalfields Heritage Centre, and many of you may recall he's left a long legacy in local politics, state politics, advocate for the Coalfields heritage in general and history, and really passionate, really up to the end. So the details of his funeral I can send to anyone who's interested in attending. It will be up at Cessnock on Wednesday. But yeah, please contact me if you want further details.
Thank you, Anne. And we send our condolences to his family. And so, Marla, as you know, we've had a few new members of staff join us since the last meeting. And Marla Scorse, our manager, will introduce them to us.
Thanks,
Over to you,
Johnny.
Marla.
Thanks, Johnny. Hi, everyone. Yes, we've had a very busy day in special collections today, and I'd like to introduce two new members of our team. Shelley Cleaver. Shelley, if you want to give everyone a wave.
Hello.
Shelley Cleaver is our new Special Collections Library Officer. So for those of you who come in to visit us in the reading room, no doubt you'll be getting to meet Shelley very soon. And unfortunately, Emily O'Connell is here with us, but we've just set her up on a new computer and we don't have the camera working, so you can't see her lovely smiling face. But we're very excited to introduce Emily, who is our new Vera Deakin internship staff member, and she is the inaugural Vera Deakin internship staff member. She's the first, and she'll be with us all year working on lots of wonderful projects to achieve Vera's aim to make local history accessible for everybody. Emily, you might just want to give a verbal shout out. Oh, no, you'll see her face at the next meeting, I'm sure. Thanks, Johnny.
That's all right, Marla. She can always Zoom bomb you or something.
Yeah, come over here, Emily, and say hi.
Hello,
everybody. There you go.
Oh, we can hear you. But,
there you go. There you go, Doug. Yeah. And Marilla, both Marilla and Daria, Vera's daughter, can't make it today. She's working on site. So, but anyway, she can see the recording. So, and we'll arrange another virtual meeting for you. Okay. So anyway, thank you. Okay, over to our first presentation. I want to really thank Richard Neville to join us today, Mitchell Librarian and Director of Engagement. Look, we've been over the moon with these beautiful engravings that we've been seeing from the Illustrated Sydney News. And I don't know if David Cypher's joined us from Maitland, but David is a real fanatic with these particular engravings that we've been able to digitise and bring to the public in high resolution. But the big wonder that we had about them was how they were done. The theories range from hot air balloons to photographs to things. I then contacted Richard to see if we could locate an expert or if he could join us and explain to us the process of how these things were made. We just got notification that another one from Newcastle in 1889, which we purchased back in February, has just arrived. So it's with us. So we'll be looking forward to scanning that at 800 DPI or something, because I just love the detail in these things. But Richard, please enlighten us on what you know about these things and be prepared for some questions.
Okay.
Over to you.
Thank you. I'm just trying to share my screen, which I hope will work. Share. Can people see that?
Yeah.
Yes. Okay. Well, yes. So welcome, everyone. I'm going to be talking just briefly about how wood engravings were made and their role in illustrated newspapers. Wood engravings were some of the most common and popular forms of illustrations that I think people would have seen in the 19th century, and certainly through illustrated newspapers, I think they give a very different perspective on what colonial life was about, because they illustrate all sorts of things that you don't necessarily see in the fine arts or photography or any other medium really. And they were designed very much to illustrate these newspapers, which were always topical. They tended to focus on celebrities, sporting events, very important in promoting the ideas of the sort of bush Australia you can see in the one on the left of your screen there, but also maintained ideas about Aboriginal life, often quite sort of shocking images, but sometimes too sort of celebrations of a life that had largely gone. So illustrated newspapers are, as you've obviously discovered, are a really important resource and fascinating things, vastly under-researched, vastly underutilised. I think they're fabulous. Now, I'm not an expert, but I know just a little bit about them, so that's what we are going to go through today. So it's important to realise that really from, say, the 1830s, pretty much to the end of the 19th century, wood engravings became very much part and parcel of the kind of visual culture of really British culture, I suppose. Accounts of it always start with Thomas Bewick, so many of you will have heard of him for the kind of wood engravings he made of animals in the late 18th century. But his great innovation was to take up into that point, most prints using wood were known as woodcuts. So they were they took the face of the wood and engraved into that. It was quite soft. It didn't really take the precision lines because the pressure of a print being pressed would sort of smash or crush the raised bits of the engraving. So what Bewick did was actually take the end grain of very hard woods, and because it was so tough and hard, it meant it was much stronger and could A, accept much finer lines, but B, was much more robust. They were very durable wood engravings, and they could take the pressure of being printed thousands upon thousands of times. So that immediately meant that many more impressions could be made of a wood engraving than, say, could be made of a copper engraving or other forms of printmaking. They became very popular, or really the Penny magazine, which was a kind of religious magazine, published and first published in 1832, was one of the first to kind of come up with the idea that magazines should be illustrated with views of popular life. So very much the same way as, you know, sort of London News or Hello or any of the kind of magazines we know today. These were the kinds of precursors of those sorts of magazines in terms of the variety and depth of images that were being produced. Now, one of the great advantages of wood engravings was that they could be inserted directly into the page. So prior to wood engravings, really, if you wanted to put an illustration into a book, it had to be printed on a separate leaf, which would then be sort of bound into the book. With wood engravings, it actually meant you could put the illustration in the middle of a bit of text. That may sound, you know, we're so used to that idea now, it doesn't sound particularly revolutionary, but at the time it was a really important innovation. And as I say, wood engravings dominated print production until the end of the 19th century. And they began to appear in Australian publications in the 1840s. And you can see the illustration here. I've taken a couple or two from a book by one of the first kind of prominent wood engravers in Australia. Was a guy called Walter Mason. And he began the Illustrated Sydney News in 1854. And I think it went for a little bit, but they were actually quite expensive things to produce. And it sort of failed by I think, around by the late 1850s at least. But he did publish something which he called the Australian Picture Pleasure Book, where he took all the engravings he'd published in the Illustrated Sydney News and put them into this one publication. And you can see here the kinds of things that were illustrated. So these were two, Sly Grog Shop. Now, you can see also up in this bit here that he's actually tried to repair the plate. So there's obviously something has gone on here. And someone has tried to insert another bit. So someone must have made a mistake in that part of the plate or that part of the block. And so someone has actually then gone around and tried to re-engrave something to fill that particular gap. Now, it did mean one of the issues with wood engraving that you used this wood called boxwood, which could only be found in Turkey and was quite expensive. And it actually had a very small diameter too. So these are just some typical pages you get. Obviously something like Ned Kelly was like any kind of illustrated paper today. Ned Kelly was always going to be the subject of this kind of publication, but also things like balloon ascents and so on. So those are the kinds of illustrations that you see. This is actually an 1844 wood engraving. So you can see the depth of the block of wood and the engraving that's put upon it. Because the plates were often very expensive, you could actually, once you'd finished with this particular engraving, you could actually sort of cut it off, polish the wood and use it again until eventually you obviously got to a point where the block was too thin to be functional. But as I say, boxwood came from Turkey, very expensive. There were attempts, one of the issues apparently with Australian conditions was that boxwood tended to warp in the colony. So there were attempts to find alternate woods, but really none of the kind of local woods ever quite matched the value and the strength and all the virtues that boxwood had. It was expensive because it was slow growing. There was only one source of it. And it also tended to be small diameter, which if you're going to make, say, these large bird's eye views, was actually a real challenge. So what you had to do, and you can see this is a wood engraved plate. It's actually made of 4 plates, 4 blocks, which are then bolted together, as you can see in this kind of plan here. And so the engraver would have to, or often multiple engravers would just work on one plate each, but they had to make sure that the lines aligned here. So it's actually quite a technical skill and really quite a challenge. So in the commercial context of newspaper illustrations, it was a combination of artists and specialist engravers, but particularly in the kind of illustrated newspaper world, it was seen as a trade rather than an art. So how it was done, the artists would take the block. So if you go back, they would take this block, bolted together, and they would then draw their view, draw what they wanted. Often it was covered with a kind of Chinese white, so it had a white surface. It was painted white, and then the artist would draw on the white surface and in a black ink. And the engraver would then be given one of these blocks, and he would then engrave away all the white. So where the line was black, it was left. Where the line was white, he would actually engrave. And so therefore you kind of got the print that you see today. So the artist would draw their image on the block, and then they would hand it to the engraver. And engravers often had specialities. So some were very good at landscape, some were good at figures, some were good at architecture. The apprentices tended to do skies because skies were very routine. You just kind of had a machine which could rule the skies in them. A large wood engraving could take up to 3 weeks to produce. So they were really kind of significant, quite significant effort was taken to actually produce them. And an 1879 bird's eye view of Sydney, for instance, was said to comprise of 70 blocks. So, you know, there was a deal of work involved. But you could actually expedite the process by farming out the blocks to a number of different engravers. So one engraver rarely did the entire set of blocks. A number of engravers would obviously work on the various blocks. So that obviously sped up the process. You often see at the same time lithographs. So I imagine as you're going through the illustrated newspapers, you'll see lithographs alongside these wood engravings. Lithographs are much faster to produce. Lithograph is a process by which you draw onto a stone, a particular stone. But whereas you could produce thousands of wood engravings very quickly, lithographs, you were pretty much limited to about 350 prints a day. So it was a much slower process. Although you could actually generate a lithograph in about a week, whereas, so, you know, there were pros and cons of both these kinds of processes. Now, they were expensive to make these illustrations. So in the mid-1870s, it was said that a half-page illustration cost about £8 to £10 to produce. So a lot of, and if you can think, you know, most of these papers would have had 10, 15 illustrations within them. That's quite a bit of the expense of the production actually went into the illustrations. And that kind of accounts for the fact that many of these papers often fell over just through to the expense of production costs and so on. So this is from the Illustrated Sydney News of 1870, and this is an illustration of the artists and engravers room. So you can see the various, these are the engravers with the good light, obviously, and you can't really see it there, but he's got a little leather pouch, or a little leather kind of cushion, and onto which he places this block, which is probably about 4 or 5 inches in diameter, and then he works on that cushion with a kind of engraving tool, and he has this fairly small artifact on which he has to try and align up with his fellow engravers who are working on other parts of the plate. Now, this is obviously one of Newcastle, one of the large bird's eye views of Newcastle. And you can see a few of the features here. Often when they came out, people were somewhat sceptical of their veracity. And you can see what the Maitland Mercury, who should have known Newcastle quite well, made of it. It clearly thought that the steepness of the streets was not conveyed, and nor was the kind of extent of the city. And to a certain extent, given the kind of scale of the proposed enterprise, it's not surprising that these things didn't kind of perhaps convey clearly enough how these didn't really provide a true sense of what they were looking at. But there was always this thing, were bird's eye views taken from balloons? Did someone go up in balloons and make these various things? And unfortunately, no, they didn't. They were pretty much kind of a work of fiction. You can see, but just a couple of things, you can see these lines here, you often see these in wood engravings. So you can see the lines down here and here and here and here, and then you can see them across there as well. Those are the various individual plates that have been bolted together to form the large bird's eye view. So you can work out this must have been 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then 1, 2, 3, probably 4 down there. So about 20 or 25 separate blocks have gone in to making up this particular view. Now, it's worth looking at them just slightly more closely, and I think you can see how these bird's eye views are created. Now, often what would happen, not so much with this one was made by a man called Albert, or the initial drawing was done by a man called Albert Cook, and he specialised in bird's eye views. But they kind of originated in England and also in America in the kind of 1830s onwards. And the idea would be that, and particularly sort of took off in the 1850s and 60s, artists would go into a town, and you often see, I think the Maitland view has a whole series of businesses set around the perimeter, and each of the print, and you can see the shop and so on, and each of those businesses probably contributed to the cost of the engraving, because obviously, you know, there'd be a couple of £100 in doing one of these things, so the costs had to be recouped. But the artist would have a broad view, take a map of the town, and then walk along the street and draw the facades of the streets he was going to illustrate. Now, if this was taken from a balloon, the perspective would be such that you'd never actually see the bottom of the streets. Yet, surprisingly, the footpath, the street itself can be seen here, and so clearly all that the artist has done is to kind of go through, walk along the streets of the town, made drawings of the main facades which he proposed to illustrate, and then has gone back to the studio, taken a kind of map of the town. Often there'd be a number of artists who were involved in the process, and then sketched the facades onto the bird's eye view, so that it seems like you're actually looking down into the town. But of course, in reality, if this was based on a photograph, you wouldn't see the bottom of the streets, and that they wouldn't have this kind of vertical nature of the buildings as they standing up as they are. So the production of these things was tremendously skilled. The engravers, often very poorly paid, and it was hard work, hard on the eyesight, hard to do in winter, for instance, when the light was poor. And engravers often complained of failing eyesight because they were made to work terrible hours in poor conditions. But it was also a tremendous skill involved. And because of this, the hardness of the wood and the detail that it could take, you could actually get incredible precision in the way these things could be printed. Now, often these plates, the other sort of side of this process, you could actually, once the engraving had been made, it could then be treated in such a way that multiple copies, a process called electrotyping, which involves making a mold of the wooden plate here, and then through various clever ways, which I can't quite get my head around, you can actually make a perfect facsimile through a sort of electronic process and the electrotyping process. You can make a perfect facsimile of the plate, and then that can also be used to run off more prints. So you virtually had the potential to make perfect facsimiles of these plates, which could then be distributed throughout the country. So you often see these engravings appearing across, the Illustrated Adelaide News, the Illustrated Australian News, the Illustrated Queensland Times, or whatever. The same plate would be reproduced in multiple papers just through the transmission of these facsimile plates around the countryside. Of course, as photography begins to develop and flourish, the artist, this kind of union of artist and engraver began to break down a bit, because there were processes developed whereby the view could be, the particular photo that you had could then be projected onto the wooden block. You'd sort of sensitize the box wood, and then you could print, or sort of, so if you like, print the photo onto the wooden block, and then the engraver would take the wooden block with the photo on it and use that as the way of producing the print. And so the artist was kind of taken out of it. I mean, what I have said makes it sound like a fairly simple process, but it was maybe not simple, but it's a matter of tremendous skill. Engravers rarely got it right first time. So there were people who were between the engraver and the printing press, so people whose particular skill it was to resurrect plates that things had gone wrong in. There were people who, would kind of, the plate would be printed once to see how it looked, and then the plate would have to be not necessarily re-engraved, but touched up in various places. I mean, it is a tremendous, it's a tremendously skillful and quite a technical process, but it really, in terms of the capacity it gave publishers to be able to print all sorts of manners of images. So you see, these amazing bird's eye views, you see sporting heroes, you see clerics, you see kings, you see weddings, you see theatrical celebrities. I mean, the whole kind of idea that we have of kind of social media and all the kind of explosion of imagery was in a much more contained sense. But in a way, these images in the sort of latter half of the 19th century had the similar kind of impact to the way we now think of images, although obviously the medium was much less clear than, it wasn't nearly as transportable as social media. But these kinds of plates here, like these coloured plates here, were often cut out. If you look at and hung up on walls, they became the kind of popular art of the day, and they were really very influential in the way that people saw colonial society and I suppose its relationship to the broader world. This kind of imagery was prolific in England, and obviously many things like the Illustrated London News is perhaps one of the most famous of all these illustrated journals. But often when local press was talking about particularly things like these bird's eye views, they would often say, look, really, you need to send these back to people in England, or people back home was the expression, so you can show them, just how wonderfully British civilization, or the empire, regardless of all the issues of displacement and unceded lands that we all live on. These were really seen as really important statements of the importance of and the success of British Empire in the colony. So really important kinds of images. Unfortunately, not many people put much effort into them, into thinking about them and how they're made and their generation, their impact. So it's great that you've taken them up with gusto, because I think they're really significant things, and there is an amazing amount of detail that you can get out of them if you kind of continue to look for them. And it's one of the great tragedies of Trove, I think, that it has in fact simply digitised microfilms of illustrated newspapers, because you get those terrible toned, just kind of really overly contrasted images of what is such a rich visual source. So anyway, hopefully people getting enthused by them and excited by them will bring people to maybe thinking about how we can look at them more closely. That's a very brief introduction. I don't know if there are any questions anyone might have.
Questions for Rich? Thank you very much, Richard. That's brilliant. And that's great about the photography, because we know that there's an 1865 photograph that Greg and Sylvia Ray sent through to us of a scene looking towards Newcastle from Stockton. And 2 years later, it was published in the Illustrated Sydney News. And we always had those two. We know that at least the photograph was used.
Yeah, so photographs were often, prior to being able to be actually sort of impose them or print them onto the plate, the artist would obviously take the photo and then interpret the photo but the photo gave them a very precise, obviously, much more precise than say something like this than a bird's eye view. So photography, you see it, I think, a daguerreotype of two Victorian Aboriginal people from the 1840 and 1848 was reproduced very precisely in the Illustrated London News in the 1850 or something. So photographs were very important source material for wood engravings.
The other wonderful thing with this particular engraving is that we were, one of the families, the Glennie family, sent us high resolution images from their family albums of those coal staves, those big long black things that people can see in that engraving on the right hand side. So we've actually got a actual photographic record of those things as well, which is great to have as a companion. So Richard, we've got a couple of questions in the chat, mostly thanks from Paige and thanks from Don Seaton Wilkinson. Laurie Allen asks, how were colour engravings done? Were there 3 plates made, each one for each of the primary RGB colours?
Yeah. I mean, that's just quickly, I mean, it's highly unlikely those ships would have been sitting in the harbour so closely together. So clearly there was, they would have been bumping into each other.
Artistic licence.
Artistic licence, yes. So with colour plates, yes, you can have up to 5 or 6 various colours. and they would be separate plates which would be inked differently. Obviously, the trick here is to make sure that the registration, so that each plate aligns perfectly onto where it needs to be. Otherwise, you get a kind of almost like a, I don't know, it just looks very blurry around the edges. But they are really exquisite. They're really beautiful things. Yes, so colour.
Yeah, well, it's the thing that sparked this, Richard, was David Cypher in Maitland, because he knows Maitland very, very closely and was amazed at the accuracy of the engraving in their case.
Yeah.
So there's the Illustrated Sydney News engraving from 1878. But the thing that completely gobsmacked him was one of these particular little businesses that you described that helped finance it. I mean, the side of the building's advertisements were completely readable.
Yes.
And you're talking about, he rang me back after we scanned it and said to me that this original thing must have been $500,000. And we started to have our doubts whether that could be wood anyway. But anyway, we've got a few people with their hands up. Marla?
Yeah, Richard, you mentioned that many of the blocks were reused over time and cut away and recycled, essentially.
Yep.
Does the Mitchell Library hold any of the original engraved blocks in their collection?
Not from this period. We do hold, there was a earlier engraver guy called William Moffat, who was a convict engraver who worked in Sydney. We've got some of his wooden blocks from the 1840s, but none from this period. And I don't actually know where many of them are. I don't know. Yeah, it'd be an interesting question. I mean, most of the industry had collapsed by the 1900s. Photography just completely wiped it out as people began to work out how you could actually print photographs directly without the intervention of an engraver. And I think a lot of the businesses just folded. And I don't know what's happening.
I'll start. Another question from Professor Nancy Cushing.
Hello, thank you so much. That was really interesting, Richard. Something that we very much take for granted, I think, just flipping through these illustrated magazines and newspapers. And so it's great to know the process, the human process through which they came into being. I wanted to ask several questions that you've addressed, but I think I will stick with one that I jotted down, which is about to what extent do these wood cuts differ from the original piece of art or the photograph? And are there particular conventions or technological limitations that mean that they distort in a predictable way?
Yeah, it's a very complex kind of. I mean, obviously, because these are particularly, say, in the 1870s and so on, there's no, you couldn't, unlike the cricket match you can see in front of you here, it's highly unlikely that this was actually something that the artist actually saw. The artist would go out to the match and make a kind of impression. So the idea is not necessarily, I mean, unlike today where you have action shots, you couldn't do that in those days. So a lot of these things were what we might now call an artist's impression, but taking liberties, like the actual action of the bowler is something you kind of quite often see. Horses is another one too, where you have the kind of rocking horse gait of a horse, and where, in other words, so its four legs are spread. They don't, we spread out, which is obviously how a horse would never gallop. But that was just the way engravers had done it from time immemorial. So really, until Edward Maybridge photographed horses galloping, horses always had this bizarre rocking horse gait. So there were kind of little visual tropes that people just accepted. Newspapers were often very keen to assure readers that their illustrations were taken from life and the artist had been there. So there's always this sense that I think viewers themselves perhaps were somewhat suspicious of what they were seeing. So the newspaper was very keen to say, look, this is what actually happened. There's a marvellous series of a rowing race between a man called Rush and Edward Trickett, the champion rower, and that happened on the Sydney Harbour or Parramatta River. And the paper was very keen to assure its readers that A, they got them out within a week of the race taking place, and B, that the drawings were taken by eyewitnesses. So there's always this sense that, well, actually you can't really trust it, but it's not really trusted. But there's an element of kind of suspension of disbelief, but nonetheless, it was still of its age, it was still an amazing kind of innovation that you could get this close to truthfulness, I suppose. So there's always a bit of ambiguity, but there was also a strong assertion of truthfulness. So you're sort of somewhere in between, I suppose. Yeah.
Yeah, I think you mentioned Ned Kelly, and because of the timing of that around 1879, 80, there were photographers around as well, and then engravings based on the photographs, and the photographs survived. So there's some interesting opportunities there to compare between the two.
Yeah, I mean that was a case where obviously there was a lot of press interest, and the press were following it, so following the events and sending photographers out there. But artists would still go out to events too. If there was a train crash or something, and then an artist would be sent to the train crash to draw the train crash and bring it back to the studio.
Thank you.
All right, wonderful, Richard. Look, thank you very much for joining us today and enlightening. It's been wonderful.
Right. Okay.
And
thank you. Oh,
thank you. Dr. Justin Ellis just says thank you for making continuity between this format and social media and skepticism about new media formats. So, all right, great.
Thank you.
Richard, thank you.
Okay.
All right, over to our next guest, and that's Emeritus Professor Lyndall Ryan, who will be talking to us about the project she's been involved with for the last 8 years and has made international news with regards to the research into the Aboriginal massacres. So over to you, Lyndall.
Thank you, Johnny.
Thank you very much for joining us as well.
Thank you for inviting me here today, and I'd like to acknowledge that I'm talking to you from the lands of the Awabakal people, and would like to acknowledge the custodians, past, present and future. I understand that Anne Hardy, I can see my internet is already a little bit unstable, so that's why I'm giving it over to Anne to put the map up. And I'll just have a few words about the map, and then I might ask Anne to enlarge the area that we're looking for. As Johnny pointed out, the project has been going for 8 years. This is stage 4 of the project we're looking at now, and it contains more than 400 sites of frontier massacre across Australia. And of those sites, about 13 of them, the ones with the blue squares, are massacres of colonists by Aboriginal people. All of the massacres have got onto the map as a result of following a rather strict methodology. A frontier massacre is the indiscriminate killing of 6 or more undefended people in one operation. It's not just anyone who is killed, it has to be at least 6 that are killed. And so the reason for the map was to bring to the general public a way of understanding the frontier in colonial Australia and getting a sense of where frontier massacres fit into the story. I might ask Anne, if she's there, to look at the blue timeline across the bottom and take us back to the beginning of the timeline, and then we'll just gradually spread it out and give you a sense of how they work. So if you'd just like to slowly start, Anne, and give us a sense using a timeline, we'll see when the first frontier massacres are recorded around Sydney, and we keep on keep going, that'll be fine. And move along. And so you can see as the colonial frontier moves across Australia, it's usually accompanied by massacre, by frontier massacres. How many happen in each region has its own story. There's a universal story, but there's also an individual story, and each massacre has its own particular story. So it gives a sense, if we end up in 1930, the last of the massacres that we've recorded are in Central Australia and in the Kimberley, which is right on the border between the Northern Territory and Western Australia, up in the far north there. A great cluster there. What the massacre map team did not expect to find, that as time went on, there were more massacres. And although we stop in 1930, we found there are more massacres between about 1860 and 1930 than in the period before 1860. And that's partly because I guess the perpetrators are better trained. Certainly weapons technology has dramatically changed and is more efficient and effective. But for our presentation today, because we're in Hunter Living Histories, Anne and I are going to look at a couple of sites, first of all, in the Hunter region. We've got Newcastle on the map. And I think if we cluster in a bit more, we should, if you can just get in a bit more, Anne, we can get to, where do we look? We'll look at the one near Dungog, I think, for some reason. Ones that came out wonderfully this morning and not doing so well today. Okay, let's have a look at the one just north of Stroud. And there's a yellow dot just north of Stroud. And this is one on the Williams River called Mill Creek. And it was 32 kilometres north of Stroud. And when you first click onto the dot, you'll get some basic information. The name of the site, where it is, how many people were killed, who were the attackers, and the date range. Usually, sometimes we can give you an actual day, sometimes we can give you a month, but we can always give you a year. And we look at the language group. But we do have more details. So you can click on, up on the top, details. You get more details of the event. First of all, you get a photograph of the site area. And it's a large site area. It's not somewhere within that site area is the site. Aboriginal people have asked us not to put the actual dot of the actual site because so many sites have been desecrated. Aboriginal remains are still there in many cases, and we need to respect them. So we've agreed to give a site area to give you a sense of where it was. Of course, today, the country is much more open. Back in the period when it happened in 1828, of course, it was much more closely, there was much more vegetation, many more trees. On the left-hand side, we give you the name, where the people came from, in this case, the Warramai. It was in the police district of Raymond Terrace. We found the police district is very helpful for helping us to look for archival information and to confirm dates and so on. So we really feel we've tried to put in the police district in every site across Australia. But most important of all, I guess, is the narrative, which is at the bottom. And in this case, Captain Thomas Cook, commander of the whole country north of Newcastle, in other words, he was the police magistrate, recorded that a band of blacks stole a child, the daughter of Mrs. Easterbrook, whose husband was a clerk of the Australian Agricultural Company at Stroud. They disappeared in a northerly direction, but were pursued by a party of armed soldiers and assigned servants and overtaken some 20 miles away. 11 blacks were killed and the child recovered. And it's from the book by Bennett. The rescue party appears to have been on foot on this occasion. They weren't on horseback. It was 1828. What we have found is that most of the massacres in Eastern Australia and Tasmania before 1830 were largely conducted on foot and usually by soldiers, but not always. After 1830, the horse becomes more widely available, and from about 1830 up to 1930, the vast majority of massacres were carried out from horseback. And the arrival of the horse in great numbers was of an enormous assistance to the colonizers in occupying Australia. I've given it, every site has a corroboration rating, in this from 1 to 3. In this case, the corroboration rating is 1 star because I only have one account. We're always looking for other accounts, corroborating accounts, sometimes a newspaper account, sometimes a settler reminiscence, whatever. So in this case, we have only 1 star, and that is a trigger for the viewer to think, I know more about that. I know of another reference or source that would help. And that's when I'd like to hear from you, and we can check out any extra sources and in due course add them to the site. So this has been very much a national project. And since the project began, or when it first went live in 2017, more than 1,000 people have contacted the research team, querying sites, giving us more information, contesting information, moving things around. So we have been very busy trying to be as accurate as possible. When we end up with 3 stars, it's an indication we really got more than enough information to confirm the site. But this particular incident north of Stroud was reported in the book by Bennett, which I think is in Special Collections. And I think I got the information from that book. And so Special Collections has played a considerable role in trying to track down information about massacres in the Hunter region. There are many more massacres in the Hunter region than will ever reach the map. I have to say, the Hunter is a code of silence. It is a site of silence. The Hunter was opened up to sheep farming and cattle farming in the early 1820s. And if you compare the Hunter with Tasmania, which was opened up at exactly the same time, the difference is between night and day. Over the same period of time in Tasmania, there were about 30 massacres. I'd be lucky if I found 4 or 5 in the Hunter. So there's more work to be done in the Hunter, more work to be done. And I've been very grateful for the bits and pieces of information that I have found, but I feel that in relation to this project, the Hunter is a hole in history. I think I'll stop there. I'm sure people have questions to ask.
Thanks, Lyndall. Look, I know of some more sources. Gordon Bennett, we took possession of the Bennett family archives a few years ago.
Yes.
From Charles Bennett. So there's probably
Yes.
some more material in there. I mean, it's just this huge amount of material to go through. But anyway, that's that including
Thank you.
Okay, so that's one thing. Now we have a question from Dr. Jacqueline Wright. Lyndall, how did you come up with the number 6?
I looked at a lot of the international literature on Frontier Massacre, and after talking with them and conversing with them, we decided that it was best that if we all kept to the same minimum number, because that would allow for important comparative work to take place. We also found that in Aboriginal communities, most Aboriginal communities, their smallest group is usually an extended family of up to 20 people, and you kill 6 people in one go from a group of 20, that's 30% of that community gone in one go. That means that a family is going to be vulnerable to further attack. They're going to be restricted in their ability to perform ceremonies and honor country, and to carry out and to search for food and fulfill other family obligations. So it's a devastating impact in one go. So, and Aboriginal communities across Australia have been very willing to accept the number 6.
Thank you, Lyndall. A question from Emeritus Professor Howard Dick. Lyndall, what is your sense of why white colonists were so indiscriminate in killing, not just payback?
Well, it's how they occupied the country. You know, they had euphemisms. We have to teach them a lesson. We have to get them out of the way. Aboriginal people were seen as, in many cases, and particularly as time went on, they were seen as a pest, they were in the way. They occupied the key water courses because Aboriginal camps are always beside access to water, and the settlers needed water for their sheep and cattle, or if they were miners, they were needing water to look for gold or whatever. So Aboriginal people were just simply in the way, and it was something that it certainly goes on well beyond 1930, but we have decided we have to stop there. So it's and it's only very recently that our attitudes have begun to change towards Aboriginal people.
Yeah, thank you. That's great.
Thank you, Lyndall. Marla, you have your hand raised for a question.
Yes, and I realise that Shelley's just asked the same question. So, Lyndall, my question was around that star rating system that you're using for
Yes.
corroborating evidence, and
Yes.
whether you use oral history as well.
Yes, yes, certainly the further north we go, Aboriginal people certainly tell their stories. However, we only used published accounts of Aboriginal stories. We have many of them in northern northern Australia, particularly in the Northern Territory and the Kimberley. In the Kimberley, for example, we have a range of what we call massacre paintings that were completed by Aboriginal artists in the 1970s of very important massacres that occurred when the painters were young people. The Bedford Downs massacre paintings, for example, are very important. However, everything has to be verified in a way. We don't use recordings, but we have used movies, but we used published accounts by Aboriginal people of massacres. Aboriginal people who are interviewed, and then their interviews are published. That means that anybody wanting to check out the source can access the source and check it out for themselves. So that's important. And as we move into the 20th century, Aboriginal voices are critical to the information we have, particularly in Northern Australia.
Thank you, Lyndall. Gillian Marsh says, yes, I'm interested in the role of oral histories too. I come from South Australia and we have a knowledge based on oral history and possibly little or none in written form. So
yes, well, get it recorded, get it published. That's the only way you'll get it out in an international context. And as you know, this project, the massacre deniers are looking for any chink to smash the whole project. And unless you've got something that's published and that can be checked out, we can't put it on the map.
Yeah.
And that's it is a problem, but I'm hoping to expose the problems so that people will understand the need to get it published or get it online or get it out there. I can't use a tape recording that somebody made a long time ago that I can't use in any other way. So this is a map where you have to just justify your sources. And if I can't justify them, I can't use it. I have many accounts of massacre that will never get on the map because the sources of information are simply not strong enough.
Lyndall, that situation came up a couple of gatherings ago when we had some discussion about Bowman's property
Yes.
and the massacre that
Yes.
happened out there. While we've been supporting the Warramai people in their campaign to get that site protected, the difficulty that we've had is getting the material at the original reports in a public
Yes.
sphere.
Yes.
And that's something we try and do through the site here. I try to get all
Yes.
the evidence out there that we can find, because we understand your point that, you know, people would love this stuff, that they don't want the evidence to be known. And so
That is
the more
correct.
confusion
Yes.
around it, the better it is. Whereas my feeling is that if we can get especially the original sources that are held in state archive reports and things like that. But there's been fights going on between the various, you know, problems with where the locations were,
Yes.
that's been stopping all that happening.
Yes.
Now, my question is basically, what would you like to have, but what would you like to see emerge out of, I mean, from the material in the Hunter region? I mean, what do you crucially need us to look for?
That's a good question. I'd like to hope that some of these old settler families might have some papers of their own that have not yet been collected in special collections or been put in the archives or the Mitchell Library, for example. And I'm sure they exist, you know. I'd like to see what's happened with the Dangar papers, for example. I think there is information around. I don't know how much, to be quite honest. I don't know how much, and maybe we'll never know. And I'd like to hope that after a while, people will look at the map and they say, why is there a gap there? Why are there no dots there? And my answer is because I can't find information. It's not that it didn't happen. There's no part of Australia where I can say nothing happened. So the map is only indicative of what happened rather than definitive in what it includes.
Okay, some more questions and comments coming in. Ollie, were details of frontier massacres intentionally suppressed at the time they occurred, or did the colonisers feel they were acting ethically and therefore there was no reason to hide details?
And the code of silence came down almost from day one, and it has not lifted. It has not lifted. There are still people who will never talk about the massacres. You will notice when you look at the map, I have virtually no massacres along the Darling River. We know that there were many along the Darling River, and it's just not there. Others were very frightened to talk about. The code of silence is imposed in the immediate aftermath by the perpetrators. And if you were a witness, you just have to keep quiet. But we have found that both witnesses and perpetrators and survivors, people, you know, little kids survive. And 30, 40, 50 years later, they want to tell somebody about it. It is a burden on them. And we have a number of cases, particularly in newspaper reminiscences, where people want to talk to a journalist or write down what they saw and what happened many decades before. And a lot of the colonial newspapers have lots of information like that. We've found that the newspapers on Trove have been a gold mine in that regard, where we've been able to know that something happened in a particular area. There's a small reference, but nothing in any detail. And then about 40 years later, a person will say, I was there, I can tell you what happened. And that, of course, that's gold to get information like that. We've had many newspapers from Queensland and Victoria have got a lot of information in that way. And there's one case on the Patterson River, just off the Hunter River, where there was a massacre, I think in 1826, or 27, March 1827, which were written up in the Australian and another Sydney newspaper. And then in 1873, which is 50 years later, the guy who was the manager of that property gave the story to the Maitland Mercury because his boss had died and he felt he could speak and tell you what happened. So that's amazing. Yeah, we get lots
memories.
of those.
Dr. Jacqueline Wright just asks, could a recording be uploaded to SoundCloud? Does it have to be published in a peer-reviewed journal?
No,
So
it doesn't have to be published in a peer-reviewed
just had to be
journal.
out there somewhere.
It
in
has to be
public
out
form.
there that
Yeah.
can be accessed.
Yeah.
You know, it's can be accessed. A lot of I would be very careful, however, about putting a lot of these very deeply personal and very confronting stories out there. You know, I think it's worth thinking how is the best way to do it, because there are people out there who will want to smash you and make your life a misery. This is very tough stuff and very tough information, and it can hurt families. You know, it can have a terrible ripple effect. So in wanting to do that, I know that there have been communities in North Queensland and in the Northern Territory who have discussed how they want to put their information out there. And it's usually by observing a range of important protocols so that people are not going to be hurt. It is interesting that the massacre denial is still very strong in Australia, and the desire to hurt people is still incredibly strong. So do be careful and think, and perhaps get advice about the best way to do it. But more and more is beginning to appear online now. There's no doubt about that.
Thanks. And Gillian Marsh just said, thanks, good advice, and can be built into proposals. Does the IATSIS database MURA hold restricted records that may not have yet been cited? And were there any records held by churches that may not have been released for inclusion?
Yes, there's many IATSIS records are very hard to get access to for very many reasons. And I was able to access some records. But I've realized in many cases you need to get the permission of the community. I felt that those communities weren't yet ready. I wasn't ready. I hadn't observed the right protocols. So this is the beginning of something of a larger picture of Australia's past. And we're just gradually making our way around and getting protocols. There are many church records that could be accessed, and they're becoming more and more available. When I began the project in 2014, a lot of church records weren't available for many parts of Australia, but over the last 8 years, many of them have become more available, and I think could have important information. And each of those is a project in itself.
Lyndall, thank you very much for joining us today. It's a harrowing topic, but it absolutely has to be looked into. I think the other half of the story is still lying out there in the valley with a myriad of family records. I don't know when that time will be right. We just keep building close relationships as best as we can with these families so they make, they feel comfortable if they do have this sort of material that we can sort of open up some kind of communication channel. And the same thing with Aboriginal people in the valley, making them feel sort of comfortable as best as there can be. That I guess this stuff has to come out somehow, and we're just happy to help any way we can. As I said, the Bennett family, I mean, we collected those records. They were 5.5 hours west to go and get them, but there's 3 generations, the original editions of those books, so there might be material lying in there. But look, it's like
okay, I will get there. Don't worry.
Get there. Well, it's huge. There's boxes, and they've still got the red dust from the desert on them. So out there. But anyway, thank you very much, and
thank you
for joining us and giving us an update. Wonderful.
Thank you very
Okay,
much, John.
now to
Thank
pull us
you.
right out of this world, we have Dr. Bill Landenberger, geologist, who will take us into the realm of these beautiful coastal landscapes and taking photography in a true 3D format. So, where are you, Bill?
Thank you, Joni. Thank you for inviting me along. And we heard before about the, I guess, the wood engravings from Richard, which was the, I guess, the forefront of image technology back in the 19th century. And I'd like to think this stuff that I've got into is the forefront of where we're at now. So I'll show you I'll take you through a slideshow and show you some of the models. I'll just turn my video off so that the screen share is a bit less jittery. And can people see that one? See the screen?
Yes, we can see it.
Yes.
Good.
Yeah, I can see it.
So actually, this was one of those things that on the day I thought, I wonder if that will work thing. And we were actually in New Zealand about 4 years ago and took a scenic flight tour from Taupo out over White Island. And so this was shot from about probably about 50 images just out the window of the tourist plane. and it worked quite well. I'll just switch over to the 3D model. Now I've preloaded these. One of the things, if you download the PDF of this PowerPoint show, is that these things take a little while to load. So they're quite large files. So, but the beauty is that you've got everything in 3D. So this is just, as I said, just shot out the window of a float plane. There's a few gaps there, of course, where I couldn't get a clear view of the surface. But this has actually become one of the most viewed models that's on the Sketchfab site because of course, what happened a little over 2 years ago with the eruption and the tourists they were right here in this crater at the time. And if you zoom in, you can actually see somewhere here, there's a helicopter sitting on the ground there. So I'll just go back to the slideshow. If I've got too many windows open here. Okay. The numbers that are on there are little annotations, and I'll show you those later on. So pretty much how I got into this was about 5 years ago. Michael Roach is actually also a University of Newcastle graduate from he even predates me. He's from the 1970s. He is from the University of Tasmania, and he's actually started up. There's a website there's links to on the end of the show called ozgeol.org, and he's the person that basically got me into all this. And at the time, as it says there, it was intended as an augmentation of real lab work and real field work. It allows you the opportunity to sort of go back to the site in a virtual sense, and like the students can go, oh geez, I forgot what I saw there, and they can go in and view the 3D model and click on it. This is a class from about 5 years ago. That's for any of those of you who might know Ron Boyd, Professor Ron Boyd. He's there. I felt obliged to. My students from the past will tell you, I can't get to advance. Why can't? That I always feel obliged to leave a Monty Python quote in all my slideshows. So there's your Monty Python quote for the day. So really what this is about is, because static photographs are two-dimensional, and it's really difficult to judge the geometry from a single photo or even multiple photos of the same surface. This is from a spot called Melville Point down the south coast, and you can see there's just 4 shots. I ended up taking about 30 of this particular outcrop, and I'll show you the 3D model in a moment. So you're really stuck for it if you want to try and purvey any sort of geometry. Now, there's 2 ways you can actually construct 3D models. There's probably more than that, but the 2 key ones would be laser scanning and photogrammetry, which is what I'm going to be talking to you about for the rest of the talk here. Both of these probably produce 3D models of similar quality. The advantages of laser scanning is that it's much, much quicker. The disadvantages of laser scanning is that it's a lot more expensive. Photogrammetry you can do with a standard camera. Phone cameras probably really aren't quite up to the mark, but any SLR camera or drone camera, you can do wonderful things with them. And this process is still an amazement to me. There's a bit of a flow chart there, so you could just take a standard digital SLR camera, and really what the software does is you collect your image, you throw it into the software, which is called AGI Soft. And basically what the software does is it tries to match pixels between adjacent images. And it works out from that what the structure of the surface actually looks like. Now, I've done several hundred of these things now, and I still sit there in total amazement watching the software. I don't watch it the whole time because sometimes the process can be quite long, can take quite a long time if you've got several hundred images. But I think about the mathematical calculations that this thing is going through, and it blows me away. Some of you probably might remember, if anyone did geography at uni, you might remember seeing stereo pairs of aerial photographs and putting them underneath a stereo viewer, and it pops out in 3D. This is sort of taking that to the next level. Okay, so depending on what you want to, what your final outcome is, then the first thing that the software does is calculate out what's called a sparse point cloud. So that's basically a rough estimate of what the surface would look like. If you want to produce a high resolution aerial photograph or a digital elevation model, then you have to take it to the next step, and it calculates out a dense point cloud. If you can see those blue squares there, that's the drone flight pattern. This is actually, I think, number 5 oval on campus. It's the one over near the Chancery. And that's a DEM that's been calculated from that and an aerial photograph. But I'll show you some more examples. Most of what I do doesn't involve DEMs or orthophotos. For me, it's really about producing the 3D surface. So if you don't need an elevation model, then you can basically go from that sparse point cloud directly to what they call the software generates a depth map, which is basically just reproducing the surface of the object or objects that you're looking at. And it creates that via a mesh. And then the final step is that it goes back to the photographs and blends the textures and overlays that over the surface that it's generated. And I'll have a few more examples to show you. So these 4 photographs here are taken from on the Fort Scratchley rock platform. So just north of the Cowrie Hole. We had a student excursion in there a couple of years ago. And this is one of the intrusive rocks. This is a basaltic dike that's intruding the rock platform there. This is just 4 of about the 20 photographs I took. So basically, the key thing is to get as many photographs as you can. Really, for an outcrop like this, 30 or 40 is sufficient. And you just pretty much just get a shot of the surface from as many different angles as you possibly can. And then it's a process of basically just popping it in the software, and it does much the rest of the work, although there's often little glitches that you've got to know some of the finer points of the software to get around errors that crop up. So then this is a screen grab of the software itself. So then you basically chuck all the images in, and you can see there it's the first thing it's done is it's created that sparse point cloud. So all those dots you can see there, the blue squares are where it's actually the dog's just decided to join in and barking in the background. The blue squares you can see there are where it's estimated where the camera position is. Okay, so it actually calculates out not just the shape of the surface, but where the camera focal plane was. And you can see that there, that sparse point cloud has got 52,000 points in it. Okay, so then you take it to the next step and it generates the surface. So this is just an uncoloured surface representation of that particular outcrop. And you can see over on the left-hand side of the window there, it actually tells you that that surface is made up of 11 million triangles. So this is where it gets mind-boggling. So it's just calculated all this by matching pixels between different images. And that's a zoom in of part of that model. So you can actually, you probably can't see through zoom, but there's each one of those little patterns there is a triangle. Okay, so it generates the depth map first, and then it generates a mesh from that. And then the final thing is to overlay the imagery, so it then blends the texture from all of the photos that you've thrown in, and it just overlays that over the top surface. And I'll just quickly switch back to the, I've got to find the right window. And this one here, and I'll just expand that. So I've then uploaded the model to a site called Sketchfab, which is sort of like YouTube, but it's for 3D models. And you can get in there and spin that round and view it from any viewpoint. I've popped a compass in there for scale, and it's also telling you where north is, so you can geo-reference these things as well. And so that's that igneous dike on the platform in there. These are, if you're wondering what these holes are, they're drill holes that were taken by geophysicists to do paleomagnetic work from that particular site. Okay, so what sort of scales? You can do it on any scale, really. I've just shown you outcrop scale, and while I'm on it, I will take you back to the one at Melville Point. That's that fold structure that you could see in the photos, but you really didn't have any idea of the geometry. So that's a fold structure from down there. Again, there's a compass. I'll just blow that up. There's a compass sitting on there for your scale, and you've even got a nice rock tool there to make you feel in the vogue there. So that's outcrop scale. You can, and I've only done one of these ones down here. Most of my ones I've done are hand specimen size, so what our geologists would call hand specimens, and I've got a thing called a light tent sitting on the table here next to me, because you need really diffuse lighting. And again, you just take photographs from a multitude of angles. The advantage of hand specimens, of course, is that they're loose, so you can actually, when you do those, you get a full solid object, so you can actually spin the whole thing around completely and see the backside of it. This is a volcanic bomb from the newer volcanic fields down in Victoria, and that's a chunk of mantle that's been brought up with the lavas at the time. The other thing you can do on the Sketchfab site is you can annotate them, so you can click on some of these numbers and it will tell you a little bit more about the different components there. So this, of course, is like 4 years ago, we had, of course, no one had any idea what was going to happen with COVID over the last 2 years, but this stuff has really come into its own because over the past 2 years, we haven't been able to run excursions and we haven't been able to run labs where students can come in and handle the rocks. So this stuff is in many ways, a poor substitute for the real thing, but it's a whole lot better than just photographs. The next thing I've got on the PowerPoint show there is you can take it down to the micro scale. This one was constructed from imagery done through a Leica microscope. That whole specimen there is only about 10 centimeters across. And when you zoom in, you've got resolution down to the 100th of a millimeter on this particular model. Of course, it's only one-sided in this particular case. And then we can go to the opposite extreme of the scale and send drones up. So you can do large outcrop scale areas with a standard camera. If you want to go larger, you really need a drone. And of course, once you send a drone up, you can produce those ortho photos that I saw before. This one here, I shot late last year. This is the Catherine Hill Bay rock platform. So this is just south of the old jetty there, and there's some igneous dikes intruding the conglomerate down there on the platform. And myself and a student produced a map from this in the space of 2 days. And a map like the one we produced prior to this technology being available probably would have taken weeks, if not months, to do. And we essentially did it in 2 days. What they call the ground survey density here is around about a centimetre per pixel. So each pixel in that image is a centimetre on the ground. You can actually see the, if I pan over here, these are the chains that they used to anchor the ships with from the Catherine Hall Bay jetty there. I'm nearly there. I've lost my pointer for some reason. This is just another example showing you the sorts of quality you can get. This is the Fort Scratchley rock platform again, this time done from a drone flown at about 40 meters. And I'm still trying to get there's my pointer. This is that same igneous dike shot from a drone, and you can actually see those little drill holes, which are only about 2 centimeters across. So again, that gives you an idea of the resolution of these aerial photos that we're dealing with. That's much better than anything you can do from a plane, and I think that's on my next little tab here. So that one there, if I can tip that up. So this is the Cowrie hole just to the south here, and the soldiers' bars at the other end. And we did a map off this image as well. Okay. So I've got 1 centimetre pixels there. Like I said, but the lower you fly, the higher the resolution actually becomes. Problems, I'm still learning, I would have to say straight away. There's always problems that crop up. Some things surprise you and work straight away. Other things that you think are going to work well cause all sorts of issues. I've learnt to use the camera in complete manual settings, so you've got to learn manual exposure and manual focus. I also collect imagery in RAW rather than JPEG, simply because there's a lot more information in RAW images. Some things are problematic. My wife's a botanist, and I've often thought about trying to do trees, but trees don't work very well. Trees trunks work well, but the canopy is full of holes, and it's very, very complicated surface, and there's a lot of hidden surfaces, and they just don't work all that well. Things that as I've said, there are glossy and reflect light in a harsh way don't work very well, mainly because the same spot on the surface looks different from different angles. And likewise, objects that have transparency in them cause all sorts of issues in the software as well, as do things that don't have much texture at all. I've actually done some models of my father when he was young, back in the 30s, as boys did. They'd actually collected birds' eggs, and some of those that are patterned work really well. But if you were to try and do a scan of a hen's egg, it wouldn't work very well at all, simply because there's no patterning on it. But look, the scope is almost limitless. I've been thinking about, of course, I've been throwing geology at you, but it's originally it was, of course, developed for, and I'll just go to the next slide. I'll skip that bit on the bottom because I'm running out of time. So it was originally, of course, developed for topographic mapping and surveying. And I've been showing you the geology application, but I'm sort of heading towards architecture and engineering now. I did one of the ventilation chimney out at Blue Gum Hills out near Minmai a couple of weeks ago. This was done with a drone, and it actually worked surprisingly well. There's a bit of a gap around this side where there was a couple of pesky trees in the way, and you can see by that tree there how it really doesn't work that well on trees, but it works real well, very well on fairly solid objects. building scale, I've actually been talking to the people who know the bishop in town, and I actually want to fly the cathedral, which is one of my things that's in the book, both inside and out. Now, I haven't actually done any inside spaces yet, but of course you can do inside spaces as well as outside. So instead of looking from the outside in, you can look from the inside out. I can see it being used for archaeological artifacts, for Aboriginal artifacts, for all sorts of things, artworks. It's the more I think about it, the more applications there actually are. Just to finish off, the other thing that's really useful for student virtual excursions, which we've had to put together over the past few years, is what they call full spherical panoramas. So again, unlike the 3D models where you're looking inwards, this is looking outward in the opposite direction. These ones really aren't 3D in a true sense, but they are quite spectacular to view. This is a site called 360 Cities. This is shot from outside the cave at Caves Beach, and you can spin this right round 360. You can look straight down. It's a bit like the stuff on Google Street View, but it's just a lot better quality, and it's absolutely stunning with a VR headset on. There's another one I've got there of the jetty at Catherine Hill Bay. And the other good thing about this site is if you click on an arrow, that one there leads to the nearby rock platform eventually. So you can do a walking tour, and you can add 3D models. You can tag 3D models within this as well, and they can go on, and the students can go and view a 3D model. So it's not as good as getting out of the field, and that's one of the things I've always loved about geology, is it gets you out of the office. But when you can't get out of the office, this is almost as good. And you can also do, I've got one final thing to show you, is that you can also do those 360 views from a drone. And this one here is done from a drone, and I'll just expand that. This is the Merewether South. So if I spin that round, you'll see Merewether bars in the platform there. But the purpose, of course, of collecting this for the student was that there's a big fault plane in the cliff here cutting down, and you can see it offsets the coal seam. This is Nobby's Tuff sitting there, and it jumps down about 10 metres on the left-hand side of the fault there. This, if you've got a VR headset on, this one's really freaky when you look down, because you're actually 40 metres above the ground. And I'll just go back to the show, and I think I'm just about there. There's some links there. So again, this one will be popped up as a PDF, and the links to the Sketchfab site, and which is the 3D models, and the 360 City site, which is those panoramas that I just showed you. There are many more, 100 of these things on this is the AusGeol website that I mentioned before, that's run out of UTAS, and there's links to the software that I've used down the bottom there. And I will stop talking at that point finally.
Thank you very much, Bill. That was incredible. We've got one question. Sorry, I didn't catch where that well in Minmi was taken from, or for what project. That was
just an idea that popped into my head about a month ago. And it's in Blue Gum Hills Regional Park. Okay. So it's about, would only be a K east of Minmi. So in where they do the treetops walk in there. Okay. All right. Well, thank you very much, Bill. I'm very worried about Glenn at the moment, because I think he's got children to pick up from school, and I'm running incredibly late. So if there are any more questions, we'll hold them off for a second. But thank you very much for joining us today and taking us through that. No worries. I'll just unshare that screen. All right. So if you have any questions for Bill, just pop them in the chat. And Glenn, are you still with us? Yes, yeah, you are. I can see you. All right. Over to you.
Yeah, well, thanks for having me along again. Not a lot to update with. We're still working on this Reverend Threcold and Biraban's story, which John has been heavily involved with again, and then is about to become more involved with. It's a really satisfying story. Some of you probably already know the story, but it's come up really, really well. We've had a lot of original artwork done for it. We've worked with graphic artists. We've got 5 different Aboriginal people involved in this project that are all really across the subject matter, and it's just going to be exciting to get it finally finished and out and show it to you guys. That comes on the back, as I mentioned last time, we've got a lot of our films finally going onto the streaming services like Binge and NITV, which is very exciting. So I hope that this film will follow in those footsteps. It's such a great story. Like, it's a world-class story, and the stuff that happens in the story kind of happened here and nowhere else. So it's going to be exciting to get that out. The other big thing is we're going to be working on this petrol film next, which is going to talk about illegal drag racing and Matara hill climb, and you know, a whole lot of stuff that will interest a whole lot of other people. So I'm just really grateful for everyone involved in this project, and Anne and John have just been amazing with all their help. And you know, and also we'll see you, hopefully some of you, at this Fortress Newcastle exhibition that's happening up at the fort. We're making a special little extra film for that about all the sites you can visit in that Fortress Newcastle, like a walk, basically what's still available that you can go to. Obviously we know about Fort Scratchley and Shepherd's Hill, but you know, how do you get to the armor-proof range out at up at Warramai National Park there? So it keeps on growing, this project. Do you have any questions? Is there anyone there? No, good.
Can't see any hands up.
I was really impressed with that 3D modeling though. That was amazing.
Yes.
I'm trying to work out how we could use it in a film. Every time I see it, it's like so.
Well, it has applications there. Most of the presentations today, I think, especially Lyndall's as well.
They've actually used it, some of the, for adding in animated characters into some of the films in the past 20 years. It's been used for that.
Mm.
Remarkable. All right. Well, hopefully next time I see you, we'll have a new film to show you. So have a good one. I'm going to go and pick up my daughter from school now.
All right. Thank you very much.
Thanks for being
I was very
invited me.
worried.
Good to see you all again.
All right.
Okay.
Great. Anne, Fringe History Series, Dr. Anne von Bertok, OAM, that you've recently put up.
Von Bertok.
Can't hear you.
Yeah, look, I thought I'd just quickly share a blog post that we put up recently. I'll just get rid of this. Yeah, so the blog post we put up a couple of weeks ago was, yeah, just reflecting on International Women's Day or week. And we shared some photographs of Dr. Anne von Bertok, who owned the Von Bertok Gallery in Cooks Hill. Did just a short interview on ABC Radio, if anyone's interested in listening back to it. Yeah, we got some lovely comments over social media. People recalled going to her gallery, remember her as, you know, quite a lively figure around Newcastle. She won the Newton-John Award back in 1988 from the University of Newcastle for her work in the arts and working with community in Newcastle. So yeah, we've just put up online a few photographs that we have in special collections, as well as a video. It's a pretty poor quality video, but it was kindly donated by Doug Lithgow a few years ago, and it's almost like the who's who of activism and heritage conservation in Newcastle in, I think it was around the 1980s, early 90s, when Joyce Bond got Freeman of the City Award. So there's a bit of a timeline here, but I just had to share, like this was put on our social media by Romaine Hoyle from Lost Newcastle Facebook page. A lot of people talked about the Von Bertok Gallery and the famous queue that was connected to the Collector's Choice, and people used to queue up a week beforehand. So the queue formed its own rules. So she's kept a copy of these rules, and I love I think it's number one in the queue has a responsibility for organising the street cocktail party for Thursday night. So it's just very animated and just sort of showed the personality and character of Anne and her gallery. And the other post that we shared during March was from Rachel Vaughan, who was our intern from Sydney Uni last year. And I'm not sure if Rachel's with us today at the meeting, but this was the second part of her project where she pulled together some other sources. And it's just to promote the upcoming Fortress Newcastle exhibition. And it's got a link to the collection site that she helped create at the end of last year. And she also put together an animated map. So here it just shows the different coastal defence forts, and they're all colour coded. So it's just a good visual way of looking and seeing where the installations were in Newcastle, and just shared some photos that she did some research and tried to source photographs that we didn't have. They weren't sort of quite common in our collections or out in the public, and lost Newcastle. So we were contacted by numerous people from the community, and this one's a beautiful one of the AWAS women, and from our collection here in Special Collections, the Country Women in New South Wales. Again, there was quite a few articles that relate to Newcastle and the Hunter. So yeah, that's those two blog posts that put up through the month.
Fabulous. All right, we're almost there.
Quickly, look, you've got Howard Dick there. Now, now the thing is, during the earthquake, after the earthquake, there was a special floor show done by who we were just talking about, Anne von Berto.
Yeah.
And I've got all those details of that, all the films, the pictures and the money that was, and how we distributed the money from that show. But there's also, Howard will remember the Stockton Bight exhibition. And I've got all those photographs that Anne had done of those paintings. They're absolutely beautiful, as you know, Howard. Howard, you provided the funding for the exhibition, you might recall. Anyway, there's a lot of interesting things about Anne that need to be done. And of course, Anne had that terrible accident on the way to Sydney when she bought that truck. Was a very bad idea. But anyway, at her age, learning to drive and so on. Anyway, listen, there's marvellous stories about Anne that need to be teased out.
I'll come in there, Doug. You've reminded me.
Yes, good. That's what I wanted.
Very briefly, everyone now is grateful for the Newcastle Bight National Park, State Park and Recreation Area. Yeah. But when we first thought of it, everyone thought, well, where is it, what is it, and why should we care? And we went to Anne and said, we want to raise awareness in the community. Could you help us to get a group of artists together? And we're going to go out there with these artists and walk around it, and then we're going to have an exhibition and give prizes to the best works. We weren't able to have it in Anne's gallery. Unfortunately, we held it in Watch Space, but Anne she just leapt at the idea, full of enthusiasm, and I think you can say that if it hadn't been for Anne and bringing it all together, there would not be a Newcastle Bight National Park today.
Absolutely.
So there's a point of recognition way outside her usual grounds, but she just saw the opportunity and we did something amazing.
Were you on any of those trips we walked out with the artists and so on? It was great.
She lit a bonfire. So
There you
much
go.
more
And
than can be said about that.
And she was there too, you know, really marvellous.
So that's a story that's yet to be documented properly. Is that right?
It certainly does.
Okay.
But look, there are photographs that Bernadette Smith did of the destruction of the radar station there at Fern Bay.
Yeah.
You know, it was part of the sand mining thing. They pinched the reserve and undermined the radar station, and it all fell down. But she's got a few. We've got a few photographs showing the actual how it happened. You know, the photographs taken, and you can see the same tree until it finally disappears. You know, from a series of photographs. Marvelous. Anyway, see you around.
Wonderful. Well, look, I've got 2 more blog posts to show you, but you'll have to see them in your own time because I have to wind this meeting up. But one, Dennis Thurlow, would interest you. It's Maitland in 1829. Could you have a look at our blog post and see whether there is an original version of that map? Because that's the earliest one that we've been able to locate of Maitland. Okay. And the other one is a map of Australia in incredible detail that we did for one of our visiting class groups. Dr. Melanie Innocence brought through her education class, and I was studying identity, Australian identity. So we digitized one of my former neighbour Doug Brown's beautiful maps, and it was the Australian Commonwealth and the world in 1925. So if you want to have a look at a nice high resolution image of Australia at that time, then enjoy. Anyway, thank you very much for being with us today, this afternoon. All right, Turu everyone, stay safe until next we see you again.